What is up, guys? So today we are going to discuss the conventional deadlift, and in particular a problem that quite a lot of people have, which is weakness off the ground in the conventional deadlift, or weakness off the floor if you want to think of it like that, right? And there are a few things that we can go through to help this, and basically it comes down to an understanding of why this occurs, and then when you understand that, then you can come up with better protocols and strategies to potentially overcome this. So let's get into it. So first of all, with the deadlift, especially the conventional deadlift, you have to understand that the mechanics of the actual lift and of your body and how those two interplay together, it's always going to leave you with a weaker starting position, right? And this is very evident if you look at, say, rack pulls, right? When you raise that deadlift off the ground, and you can do this like very progressively, slowly up, higher and higher, with something like a rack, then you can clearly see that as you raise that bar up off the ground, the lift gets easier. And this is very evident in terms of the amount of weight you can then use on the higher and higher positions in that rack pull, right? Like if your hips, it's actually pretty easier to think of it in terms of how far your hips go back and come back to that center line, right? So obviously the bottom position has your hips shifting back a lot further, so those hips have to drive back to that center line at a greater distance. But as you raise that bar up, that distance shortens, right? So if you literally are 1 inch away from locking out your hips, right, like that's in a very advantageous position for you to just move the hips. It's very short distance that those hips have to move, right? So again, thinking of your deadlift from the ground, if we're in the worst position we can be in terms of our ability to produce force, just thinking of the hips, right, then obviously it's going to be weaker off the ground. Now, it's not actually as simplistic as that, because there are other things at play, as you'll see in this, and we're not including the knees in that very simplified rationale, right? And this is one of the things we'll see later on in this, where you should be using your quads to get the bar off the ground, which some people aren't, but you can very clearly see that the actual mechanics of the lift itself, like the deadlift, it doesn't lend itself to allowing you to be strong off the ground. So you're always going to be at a disadvantage from that start position. Now, some people, again, depending on their exact mechanics and the exact way they do the lift, they might find that they are in fact strong off the ground, right? But that would be more so a rarity than the rule, right? You can also see this in lifts such as the overhead press, and what I mean by that is the deadlift is a concentric first movement, right? So you perform the concentric portion of the lift first, right? So this leaves you with or leaves you in a position where the hardest bit is the thing you do first, because you're always stronger in the eccentric portion of a lift. So if you're going on your bench press, you unrack it and you slowly lower it to your chest, you're doing that eccentric portion first, right? That's not the same thing as a deadlift, where you have to raise the bar first, right? And then you can slowly lower it if you wish, So it's backwards then how you would perform other lifts, right? Except for something like, say, the overhead press, which normally you would start at your kind of clavicles, and then starting from that, you would do the concentric first, right? And again, you see this mirrored in terms of how people talk about those two lifts. They're like, oh, I'm really weak off my clavicles, the start position of that OHP, once I get it going, then I can move through it. It's the first rep that always gets me. And again, people say the exact same thing about their deadlift. They're like, it's the first rep that really, it's really hard to do. And then once I get it moving and I can do, almost not bounce it, but lower it down and then raise it back up, like they can go through that a lot easier. So again, it's just the actual nature of the lift itself. If you wanted to get rid of this thing in the deadlift, what you could do is just kind of walk your deadlifts out from a rack. And what I mean by that is, like, start them in that locked out position, take it off the rack or the hooks in a lowered position, walk it backwards like people would do, like with, say, an RDL, for example, and then lower the weight first, so you can do the eccentric portion first. Now, I wouldn't recommend that. Like, I don't think that's a great strategy to really build your deadlift. However, that is, if you wanted to do the eccentric first, that is something that you could in fact do, right? Now, for a lot of people, the issue with being weak off the ground isn't necessarily to do with the lift itself. Now, obviously, again, pretty much all of us are weaker off the ground than we are at the top position, again, due to the mechanics of the lift itself, right? However, people approach, again, due to the concentric first approach to a deadlift, people approach the actual way they program the deadlift and then also the way they actually perform the deadlift a lot differently, right, than they would, any other exercise in their program, right? And this effectively leaves you in a position where you're not weak off the ground, you're just weak or too weak for that lift, or for that weight. And what I mean by that is most people try to max out their deadlift. Like, they literally go to as heavy as they possibly can for their deadlift. And they would never do that for any other lift. Like, you don't see people like walking out their complete max every single time when they go to squat. Obviously some people do, but the majority of people are like, no, you know what? I'm actually going to go sub-maximally, Like, you don't see people often walking out something they've never done before just every week, because that's what people do with the deadlift. They're like, well, last week I did, 140 kilos. This week I'm going to try 150, Like, you wouldn't do that in your squat every single week, try to add, 10 kilos, 20 kilos, whatever. But people do that in their deadlift, or they go really, really close and potentially beyond their actual max. And then they're like, oh, well, I'm weak off the ground because it didn't budge. When in reality, it's like, you were just at like 97% of your max, 100%, or that weight was 110% of your max, and it's not, you wouldn't do that with your bench press, or you wouldn't do that with your squat or any other lift, So you have to keep that in mind, that the way people are approaching the lift itself, because it's inherently, less, we'll call it dangerous, in terms of how you view it, because like the worst thing that can happen with, I tried to lift my, max deadlift and it just didn't budge from the ground. Maybe you generate a little bit of fatigue from that, but that's the worst that happens, right? If you did that with your bench press or your squat, it's like, okay, I took out this weight that I've never handled before, haven't peaked for this, haven't been training, very specifically to, ensure that the weight that I'm unracking is a weight that I can use, and you just took it out on your bench press and lowered it to your chest, and then cut yourself in half basically, because it's just something that you have no right to be handling. Or the squat as well. You don't walk it out, 110% of your max and try to then go, maybe today's the day that I can do this, and you just get folded in half, So again, the way people are approaching their deadlift is different than the way they approach other lifts. And again, this is reflected in how people then experience it and say stuff like, oh, I'm just weak off the ground. You're not weak off the ground. You're just using weights that are too heavy for what you're trying to do. Again, the easy fix for this is to just actually train sub-maximally, like you should be doing for the majority of your lifting anyway. It shouldn't be balls to the wall, 1 rep maxes every single week on the same exercise, So again, this is more of a programming thing. And then you need to dive a little bit deeper into understanding, how to program effectively for strength goals, bodybuilding goals, or whatever it is, Then, in terms of your technique, this is the next area where people, effectively shit the bed with the deadlift, and then they say, oh, I'm just, weak off the ground. And they're weak off the ground because their technique is awful for being strong off the ground. And what I mean by that is, your legs are the thing that are supposed to generate leg drive to allow you to, get the bar off the ground. So if you're not using your legs, like you're trying to deadlift with your hips as high as possible, you're not going to be strong off the ground. You're effectively trying to do a stiff leg deadlift, right? Or what you'll often see people do is their entire back will be completely rounded over, and they're trying to use every single vertebral column as a fucking lever, like it doesn't work. Now, yes, you can have some upper back rounding, that's perfectly fine, but I'm talking about people's entire back is like folded over. That's obviously not an effective way to, first of all, get good results from the deadlift, but also not be strong in the deadlift, So you're going to have to reassess your technique. If you're like, oh, I'm weak off the ground, and you've never really worked on your technique, and you've never learned how to get effective leg drive from the start of that movement, you've never effectively held a strong spinal position, like that's what you need to go back and do, and it's hard to do yourself. Like you can record it, you can, view it, and that's what we generally recommend, but you might not know what you're actually looking for. So in this case, it's probably a good idea to get some help in terms of asking a coach, perhaps maybe a coach at your gym, maybe, use social media, whatever. But it probably is a good idea to have someone who knows what they're talking about look at your lift and assess what's going on. Because even the last topic that I talked about there, just using too heavy weights, like a good coach will be able to see that straight away. Like you can look at someone and be like, oh, you're strong enough to do that, but your technique here is, we need to fix this and this, or they'll just look at that and go, that's just not a weight you should be handling. Your technique is awful, right? So again, paying someone even will obviously get you the best results, but obviously with social media and stuff, you can effectively do this for free to some extent. Now again, don't expect the most in-depth world-class reply if you're not willing to pay someone, but again, it can help point you in the right direction, right? The other thing is, and on technique especially, you just may not be built to do the deadlift, right? Like I'm nearly 6'6", right? I could use that as an excuse and say I'm just not built to do the deadlift because my femurs are like 2 meters long themselves. But for me, other things with regards to my mechanics allow me to be somewhat effective at deadlifting. But I know that very bottom position, that's a very hard position for me, right? Again, it's just the way my mechanics are. My hips are just generally always going to start higher. So I'm not going to be able to effectively generate a lot of leg drive to, get that bar off the ground, and that's just my mechanics, right? Your mechanics could very well have you in a position where, that bottom position is way harder than it is for me or for someone else, and it's just going to lead you to a position where, it's not effective for you to be deadlifting. You're just completely limited in terms of that last, inch off the ground. You're just not able to do it effectively. And, that first inch off the ground is 1,000% harder than once you get over that inch. It's like, oh, this is actually way easier and I can actually lift heavier weights. I seem to be getting better results muscle-wise, strength-wise, and, lacking in pain-wise. So, again, understanding your unique biomechanics and biomechanics in general is probably a good idea if you want to get the most from a lift, Now, you can go, oh, well, I have to deadlift from the ground. Like if you're a power lifter, 100%, you have to deadlift from the ground. So you're going to have to come up with strategies, especially if your biomechanics don't allow you to effectively produce force there. You're going to have to come up with strategies to, overcome that. But if you're not a power lifter and you're like, I just want to, generally get my hip extension stronger or my posterior chain stronger, then there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to just, elevate the deadlift to a good starting position for you and then get more from the lift itself, or potentially choose a different exercise that targets the same, musculature in a more effective manner for you, But again, this is something that it can be very hard to understand yourself, and you might need to outsource the understanding to someone who has does this for a living or whatever. Again, getting your biomechanics assessed, getting to look at your technique, getting good programming, all that kind of stuff, And this is again particularly hard because what you'll see is people compare different people on a very superficial level. Like I said, I'm nearly 6'6", so someone will go, oh well, strong men, they're like 6'10", and they're the best deadlifters, and again, you can be like, all right, that's cool, but that means nothing for you at an individual level. Like these strongmen are like 400 pounds. You at 180 pounds, it's not comparable. Even if you are the same height, it's just not comparable, So again, this is an individual endeavor, understanding your biomechanics. So again, this has to be individualized to you. So it's very hard for me to go, yeah, this is the exact protocol you need to do in terms of, the lifts you need to do, the exercises, the technique adjustments. It's a very individualized thing. But what I am suggesting is you take some time and do this for yourself and understand how your unique biomechanics play into your ability to actually effectively, generate power off the ground. Right. The next thing then is, we'll call it fear, right? And what I mean by this is people start a deadlift very slowly and very fearfully, rather than, approaching it aggressively. Now, I don't mean obviously those people that are going in there and going, "Oh, I'm getting hyped up," and they try to yank on the bar, and it's 120% of what they can actually lift, and they're just hoping that they can lift it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who are already did the last two things. They assess their technique, they assess their programming, they're lifting weights that they should be able to lift, and all that stuff is already squared away. The next thing then is, people, they have a little bit of fear in terms of the bar slipping out of their hands, right? Now, again, this can be somewhat dealt with just chalking up your hands, or potentially even if it is a serious issue for you, or maybe you're a strongman, or whatever you're trying to do allows you the use of like straps or something. Like if you're trying to just use deadlifts for like bodybuilding purposes, then again, there's no reason not to use straps, So you could do that, chalk up, all that kind of stuff. But there's also the mentality aspect of it, where if you're constantly afraid that it's going to slip out of your hands, then you're not going to really maximize the force you put into it in terms of getting it off the ground, because you're going to be thinking about that rather than actually getting it off the ground, right? The next thing then on this is people have an inability to pull the slack out of the bar. And what I mean by this is people just don't do it. They just try to, from a complete standstill, complete stop, yank on that bar and perform the entire movement, when that's not what you want to do. You want to take the slack, which is the kind of the bend in the bar. Like there's obviously, you can talk about like the tensile strength of that actual bar itself and all that kind of stuff. But effectively all you need to know is, like, before you actually perform the lift, there is a little bit of give in the bar. So you want to take that out of the movement. So you want to already put a little bit of tension on the bar itself and get yourself into a good position, and then actually perform the lift. Because what will happen often is people will really push force into the ground having not done that, and that switch from like 0 to tension, that fatigues them too much to actually get the movement. There's too much momentum, there's too much variability in that, where they thought the movement was going to be hard at the start, and they effectively pulled into nothing, then hit a brick wall, and then tried to pull through the brick wall, rather than pulling the slack out, starting at that brick wall, being able to feel that tension, and then being able to produce force through that brick wall, right? So again, this is something that you probably will have to work on with a coach, or again, just someone who knows what they're talking about, to really help you see and visualize what that means. And there's great videos online and whatever else, but you need to be, again, individualized to you, even to the bar that you're using in your gym, So with this, there's some easy fixes for this, but again, these are all just generalized. This is not very specific to your exact needs. Again, with all this information, that's the same. You can do some like faster submaximal work, like people like speed deadlifts, that kind of thing. Some people like the Olympic lifts for this. I think it's a bit of a waste of time, really, in terms of you have to learn the Olympic lifts, which are very hard lifts in and of themselves, to just get a little bit of potential benefit for your deadlift. Like, it's not a great use of your time, So I would just like to use, or I generally just use, faster submaximal lifts, and maybe 60, 70% even of your deadlift, and really just focusing on, good technique, good actual speed off the ground, that kind of stuff. You can also obviously work on your grip, or as I said earlier on, potentially just take it out of the equation to some extent with, chalk, that kind of stuff, or to a greater extent with like straps. Again, learning to pull the slack out of the bar, and then actually committing to the lift, because there's so many people that as soon as they feel that little bit of tension, and they're like, oh no, I'm out, I'm done, rather than actually learning to pull through that, and then actually again committing to the lift. Then finally, there are obviously some muscles that you can strengthen to potentially help, and obviously the thing is strengthen all of the muscles that are involved, and you will get better at it. Like that should be a no-brainer. However, there are some specific muscles that we can focus on to potentially aid in strengthening that strength off the ground, and these are generally the quads, the grip, as I stated, and then the core itself overall. Again, the core, especially if your technique is shocking, like that's something that you can really work on and see a great benefit very quickly. The quads, obviously, again, as I said, the legs are the things that are producing the force off the ground. So strengthening the quads, getting them bigger, getting them stronger is a good idea. And again, this in particular can be very effective for powerlifters who are we'll say wide stance squatters, low bar squatters, and they're very posterior chain dominant and they haven't really worked on their quads at all. Like, this can be something that's a huge game changer, where they do some, sets of like leg presses, and all of a sudden they're like, wow, my deadlift is blowing up, right? And again, it's just because they're able to get more force off that ground, like the starting position, right? There's also movements, of course, that you can focus on, which, help to tackle some of the issues that come up with this. You can do like pause deadlifts, like do the start position, pause, 2-3 inches, halfway up your shin, whatever, pick a position. It doesn't really matter overall. And then again, pull through that. So pausing in positions that are disadvantaged, or positions that you're like, oh, I'm actually weak here. Obviously, it's a great idea. Same again, low handle trap bar deadlifts. Trap bars are like, effectively, it's kind of a mix between a squat and a deadlift, so it can be very effective for this, especially if you're using the lower handles, which means you have to squat down effectively a little bit more, and thus generate more leg drive in a very similar manner. But again, this has to be specific. Like, these are all just generalized. The article that accompanies this goes in more in depth to this, but again, this is just a video. Clean deadlifts, which if you're unfamiliar with, it's effectively the way that Olympic lifters do deadlifts, which is generally they'll have like Olympic lifting shoes on with this, and there's a lot more squat in this deadlift than there is hip hinge, even though obviously there is both. These can be quite effective for this, but again, it has to be specific to your needs. Deficit deadlifts as well, same as snatch grip deadlifts. These can both be used quite effectively, but again, like, if you have a biomechanics issue where you're just not built to do the bottom position, these are just going to exacerbate that issue. If you're trying to be like, oh, my biomechanics don't allow me to effectively get into a deeper position, get my hips lower, like, lowering the bar isn't going to fix that. So again, all of these exercises, or all of these targeting of muscle groups, it has to be specific to your needs. Like, this video just gives you a generalized overview and potential maybe I could do this and maybe I could do this, but it should be specific and tailored to your needs. It shouldn't just be, oh, I found some general information on YouTube or on some website. Like, again, it's just generalized information. It's great for a launching point. It's great for giving you an idea of what potential you could work on, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all of your knowledge. Again, it should be a tailored approach to your specific needs, rather than a generalized approach to the masses, because that's all I can produce in this video. I can just go, yeah, these are some potential issues, these are some potential solutions, but all of these may not be your issue at all, and the solutions may not be effective for you. Okay, so again, it's just an understanding that I want you to get from these videos. So thanks for listening. Again, there is an article that goes along with this video, so if you are interested, I would recommend reading that. Obviously, it's more succinct, in-depth, and to the point than this video, so I would recommend reading through that. And then, of course, you can join our email list, join our free Facebook group, and then it would obviously help if you subscribed, liked the video, do all that fun stuff.